So today we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. And, in particular, I want to cover how Satan, characterized as the serpent, was able to get Eve to be able to see things differently. And it's through a technique that he uses, which is just his basic line of questioning. So we'll read Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. And the serpent was cunning above every animal of the field which Jehovah God had made. And he said to the woman, Is it true that God has said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat of it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. And the serpent said to the woman, You shall not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as God, knowing good and evil. So first and foremost, we see that the serpent is characterized as cunning. Another word that you'll see in some of your Bibles is crafty, right? Deceitful is what it means, right? He's really good at tricking individuals. And obviously, in order to trick somebody, you can do it in more ways than one. So don't even think that you can only do it through one way, right? Through blatant lying. And I think a lot of people, when it comes to Satan, they think that it's just going to be blatant lies. No, that's not the case. Sometimes it's massaged, and it's requiring of you and your intellectual ability by God, through God, to be able to sniff this out. You see this in Matthew 4 when Jesus is being tempted and tested in the desert by Satan, right? One of the lines he uses is of the Bible, but it's not in the proper context. And so that's one form of deceit that Satan can use. But here with Eve, what does he use? We go back to it. It says, Is it true that God said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden? Now, the question seems harmless at face value, but what is Satan doing here? He's framing it through the lens of negativity. You see what he's doing? He's trying to get Eve to see it negatively. This is the reason why he asked the question the way he asks, right? Again, it says, Is it true God said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden? Well, what does God say, right? We have to ask ourselves. That's the $1,000,000 question there. What does God say? So we'd have to go back a chapter previously and see Genesis chapter 2, verse 16, in which God says this. And Jehovah God commanded the man, saying, You may eat freely of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you may not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. This is God's command. See, God's command is not framed in the way that Satan framed it. Satan framed it in the way in which you're just looking at it through the lens of negativity. You're looking at it through what you cannot do. God's looking at it through what you can do. You may eat freely of the fruit of the trees of the garden, right? Of every tree, might I add. That's exactly what he says, right? But Satan framed it as what you can do. This is something we ought to understand and apply on a grand level, right? On a greater level to our own lives. We see this with non-believers. They always look at the Bible as something that's a book of rules. What we can't do, what we can do. We as believers, we need to not look at it like that, right? We need to look at it as what we are able to do through the love, right? And we express that through the love that we have for God because he loved us before we loved him, right? Satan doesn't do this. Satan does it the opposite way. He wants you to focus on the negativity, what you can't do, what you're unable to do, what's boring you. Whereas God wants you to see it through the lens of truth. Because as Jesus tells you in the Gospels, the truth will set you free. And so God sets you free through his decrees. But Satan wants you to take God's decrees and to look at them through the lens of negativity. He actually wants you to do this thing called perceive it negatively. Look at it as, I can't do this. Not as, I'm able to do this. You see how that works? Again, he wants you to look at it through the lens of, I cannot do this, not through the lens of, I am able to do this. See, God gives it to Adam as what you can do, then what you can do. But Satan gives it on the forefront to Eve as what you can't do, right? You cannot eat of the fruit of the trees, of all the trees, right? That's exactly how he frames it. And so we see her response. She says what? The woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden. Now, this also doesn't seem like a problem on the surface, but it is, because what does God say? God quite literally says you may eat of every tree. Now, he doesn't say just of trees, because her statement of saying of trees insinuates what? It suggests what? It suggests that there's other fruits of other trees that you can't eat from. Well, that's not true. That's what she's actually suggesting when she says this, by the way. She's suggesting that there's other trees that were off limits, not just the one tree that he said, which is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? And so furthermore, we see what? It says, But of the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God said, you shall not eat of it. Is that true? No, it's not. That's not true, right? He says what? Let's go back. It says, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you may not eat. Question, how many trees are in the middle? How many trees are in the middle of the garden? Is it just one tree? Let's go back to Genesis chapter 2. Earlier, even previous to verse 16, in this final command, this general great command to not eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Let's go back to Genesis 2, and we're going to look at verse 9. And out of the ground Jehovah God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was also in the middle of the garden, also the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Would you look at that? There's more than one tree in the middle. But what does Eve say? Let's go back to what Eve says. She says what? The tree which is in the middle of the garden. She made it what? She made it out to be singular. She said what? There's one tree. The tree that's in the middle. There's two trees. The tree of life is in the middle, alongside the tree of knowledge of good and evil. See how Satan's question has now, as she's taken the bait for his question, has now allowed her to view this in a lens through a visual that is not of God, in which she's doing what? She's lying. She's omitted things, right? Omission is a form of lying. And now she's omitting the fact that God never said this. As a matter of fact, God made two trees in the middle. He didn't make one. And so when she says a tree, right, she says tree. That's singular. Trees, plural. We know this, right? Basics to English. And so with that being said, we see that what? Not only she just made it seem like there's other trees that you cannot eat the fruit of, she also made it seem like there's only one tree in the middle, which is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Can you see what Satan does to her? Can you see what he does to her? Can you see what he does to you? Can you see what he does to me sometimes? Can you see what he does to the inhabitants of the world? Sometimes he gets us to see things a different way. This is exactly what Satan has done here. With his question, he has now allowed Eve to do what? To see this differently. She's now not visualizing it through the righteousness of God. She's actually viewing it through what? The unrighteousness of Satan. She's viewing this the way she ought not to. Well, now she's doing what? She's becoming like the serpent. She's lying. She's omitting certain things, right? Because she is now fed into his what? To his line of questioning. She's fed into his worldview. She's fed into the way he sees things. And the way you see things is very important. We see this in Genesis 1. We also see this in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, verses 22 to 23, when Jesus talks about the righteous eye, which is also called the good eye. And then he talks about the bad eye, right? So the way you perceive things is very important. And the question that others ask you might also impact and influence the way you view things, as you see here. Now, if we keep going on, we see that what? She says, you shall not eat of it, which is correct. Now watch this. She says, you shall not touch it. Did God say that? No, let's go back to what he said. He said what? The tree of knowledge of good and evil you may not eat. That's all he said. For in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. So did God ever say you can't touch it? No, you can touch it. You can look at it. You can probably pluck fruit out of it. But you can't eat it. That's the only thing you can. You just can't eat it. That's it. See how that works? And so now furthermore, we see what? What does the serpent say? The serpent says, you shall not surely die. So now he's just blatantly lying to her, right? This is now blatant lying, right? He said, you shall not surely die. It's like, well, that's not true. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as God, knowing good and evil. What's the issue with this statement? There's one key core issue. Well, you won't be like God, because God's knowledge doesn't come from the same source that the knowledge that you would acquire here would come from, would it? No. God's knowledge comes from where? Himself. The knowledge that Eve would be acquiring would come from what? The world. Where does knowledge come from? You see this in the Proverbs. This is in Proverbs chapter 2, verse 6. It says, for Jehovah gives wisdom. Who gives wisdom? Jehovah, God, the Lord. He gives wisdom. Not a tree that bears fruit that you pluck out and eat. No. Not from the earth. There's earthly knowledge and there's heavenly knowledge. See the words? Heavenly knowledge and earthly knowledge are two different things. You'll see the difference between the two things in James chapter 3. So if you go to James chapter 3, you'll find the differences between the two. But what you need to know for the sake of this video is that what? There's two different types of knowledge. So which one is she going after? You see, atheists we use as a common objection. God doesn't want us to know anything. No. It says right here, Jehovah gives wisdom. So God will he'll give knowledge where he sees fit. He'll give knowledge. He just will. And if they had waited patiently, Adam and Eve, he would have given them knowledge in due time. But they didn't. They chased after what? Earthly knowledge. Not the knowledge from above, but the knowledge of the earth. And that's the issue. That's at the key core. That's the key core issue, right? That's the heart of the problem when it comes to Adam and Eve, right? One of the key core issues is that Eve, was in search for knowledge, as you'll see later in the chapter where it says that one of the reasons why she ate of the fruit was that it had the desire, if it would have fulfilled her desire to make her wise, right? But that's not coming from what God is coming from the earth. And then later in the verse in Proverbs 2:6, it says, out of his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. So from his own voice comes what? Comes forth knowledge and understanding. Knowledge and understanding that you would acquire if you what? If you search for him, Jeremiah 29:13, right? That's exactly what you get. But if you sit there and you do what? You're antsy. And you're in search for knowledge and truth through your own means, you won't find it because it's not from God. This is exactly what Eve's issue was. This is how Satan was able to get her. And so all in all, what I want you to take out of this video is this, is that Satan can craft things. Things are crafted in such a manner that what? That a question, a simple question as he asked, right? Which is, you shall not eat from any of the tree of the garden. Can get your head spinning. Can get you to view things in a certain way that you're not supposed to view them, right? It will change the framework and the dynamic of the question. And it'll get you to see things through a lens that you had not previously seen it before. Much to your chagrin, right? Much to your dismay. And as we see here, much to their downfall, right? And so it's very important because Satan is a crafty individual that you do not fall for any line of questioning. Questioning, you're going to have to examine the questions. Don't answer every question. And if you have a question posed to you, take the time to think about it, as she should have, but she didn't, right? As you can quite clearly see, because even in her response, what's embedded within her response? Lies, via omission or adding, right? Adding when she said that you can't touch of it, and then omission in the sense that that there's more than one tree in the middle. It's not just one tree. And so Satan gets her to view that there's only one tree, but there's another tree that gives life, right? It's called the tree of life. She could have ate it from there, but she chose not to, right? Because Satan had fixated her on what? Just that tree of knowledge of good and evil. Basically insinuating what? That tree of life is not good enough, right? The tree that is called the tree of life is not good enough for you. You need to acquire knowledge of good and evil. This is necessary. This is what I want you guys to take out of the video, that you need to be sober-minded. You need to be vigilant, as the Bible tells you, and you need to understand and ask yourself questions as people ask you questions, so you don't fall for their wicked ways. You don't fall for the ways of Satan, as Eve did in Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 4.